story of baby Emmanuel Haro begins not with a headline, but with a sound soft, ordinary, and devastatingly human. A cry that no one heard in time. In the late summer of 2025, inside a quiet home in Cabazon, California, a 7-month-old boy lost his life in circumstances that should never have been possible. His parents, Jake and Rebecca Haro, would later present themselves before cameras as grieving victims, pleading for help and answers. Yet behind the sorrowful faces, investigators discovered something far darker. A fabricated kidnapping, a timeline of contradictions, and a trail of deception that revealed a truth no parent should ever be capable of hiding. What struck me first when I began following this case was how meticulously the illusion was built. There were tears for the news crews, statements of heartbreak, and stories that seemed plausible enough to dull suspicion. For several days the narrative held. A baby was missing, the parents were devastated, and the town of Cabazon rallied with candles and flyers. It was the kind of tragedy that unites communities in shared grief. But grief built on falsehood is a fragile thing. It cracks under scrutiny. It shatters the moment truth begins to surface.
His final hours were the darkest, most painful, and terrifying of all. Tonight, we take you on a journey where truth and deception collide. They didn't just injure and torture their son, they murdered him. And then, with carefully crafted lies, they manipulated society into believing their story.
Those words from the original broadcast transcript encapsulate the entire emotional architecture of this case, the collision between truth and facade, between the innocent life that ended and the elaborate performance that followed. What made Emmanuel's story so haunting wasn't only what happened inside that small house, it was how easily the world believed what was shown outside of it. Neighbors later admitted they had heard raised voices, slamming doors, and late-night arguments. Some brushed it off as exhaustion, others as the struggles of new parenthood. The silence that followed wasn't malicious, it was ordinary. That ordinariness is precisely what makes this case unbearable. We often assume danger announces itself loudly, but in Cabazon it arrived in whispers quiet enough to ignore, familiar enough to excuse. The importance of Emmanuel's story reaches far beyond the borders of his town. It exposes how society measures safety through appearances, and how systems designed to protect the vulnerable can overlook the simplest warning signs. It compels us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes evil hides behind the same smile we greet at the mailbox. Telling Emmanuel's story is not about revisiting horror, it is about confronting our own collective blindness. Each overlooked sound, each unanswered instinct, represents a moment when protection failed. His death is a warning carved into the conscience of anyone who dares to look closer. It demands vigilance, empathy, and accountability not from institutions alone, but from every person who believes that tragedy could never unfold next door. Emmanuel's pain. When I began tracing the story behind baby Emmanuel, the first image that appeared wasn't of crime scene tape or flashing lights. It was the modest single-story house in Cabazon where everything began. At first glance, it looked like any other home in the neighborhood. Weathered siding, a small patch of grass out front, and the faint hum of desert wind weaving through the open spaces. Yet even before investigators arrived, that house carried an unease that words couldn't quite describe. The Haro family's life in Cabazon was ordinary on the surface but fragile underneath. The walls, though standing, felt temporary as if built more from habit than from hope. The structure leaned against the desert's dry resilience, reflecting the family that lived inside it, together, yet splintered. Jake, the father, had once worked as a mechanic. He carried himself with the quiet pride of someone who knew how to fix broken things, though ironically, he seemed unable to repair what was fractured within his own home. His past shadowed him, a criminal conviction years earlier involving harm toward a child from a previous relationship. That act had altered his life permanently, and though the record was years old, it followed him like a silent observer in every new beginning. Rebecca, Emmanuel's mother, was older and soft-spoken. To those who met her briefly, she appeared attentive and calm, the kind of person who smiled politely but rarely shared more than a few words. To the outside world, she was simply a mother trying to navigate the early months of raising a baby. But those close to the family sensed something strained in her silence, an exhaustion that ran deeper than sleepless nights. The couple's relationship oscillated between affection and tension, their interactions often dictated by circumstance rather than choice. That observation from the transcript lingered in my mind. It perfectly described the duality of their existence, the illusion of calm daylight and the hidden unrest of their nights. Cabazon is not a large place. People know one another, wave at passing cars, and notice when something feels off. Yet in this case, familiarity bred complacency. The Haro's home became just another part of the scenery, its secrets muffled by routine. Emmanuel entered the world in January 2025, A fragile new life arriving into a household already cracking under emotional pressure. Photographs later recovered from family albums, Shun wrapped in a pale blue blanket. His eyes half open as though he could already sense the dissonance around him. Visitors described the home as cluttered but functional, baby bottles on the counter, laundry folded but never fully put away, the ordinary chaos of early parenthood. Yet beneath that surface, there was an absence of warmth. Conversations between Jake and Rebecca often drifted toward blame, each one speaking past the other rather than with understanding. I often wonder how a place meant to shelter could instead become a stage for unraveling. The Haro home was not one of overt ruin, but of slow erosion, trust thinning with every disagreement, affection replaced by fatigue. Jake's past anger never disappeared, it merely learned to whisper. Rebecca, caught between defending her partner and protecting her child, seemed frozen in indecision. Those who visited sensed tension but couldn't name it. That's the danger of subtle dysfunction, it hides in plain sight, disguised as normalcy. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, its silence almost complicit. The neighbors went about their lives, sometimes hearing a door slam, sometimes seeing Jake working on an old car by the curb. No one suspected the extent of the emotional fracture within that small home. And perhaps that's why the tragedy that followed hit so hard. It unfolded in a place so unremarkable that no one thought to look twice. Emmanuel's short life became defined by the atmosphere around him, one of uncertainty and instability. The patterns of conflict, the quiet resentment, the emotional distance, all of it accumulated like dust on the windowsills. Yet even amid that tension, there were fleeting moments of normality. Rebecca would take him out on walks during cooler afternoons, shielding him from the sun with a towel draped over the stroller. Jake would occasionally wave to neighbors while holding his son, performing holding edge of fatherhood even when affection had long been replaced by performance. As the weeks went by, the cracks widened. Financial strain grew heavier, and communication turned into silence. Every relationship has a breaking point, and for the Haros, that point arrived quietly, without anyone realizing it had already passed. In hindsight, the signs were the same signs society too often overlooks, because they seem too small to matter. But in Cabazon, those small moments built the foundation for what would become one of the most haunting cases in recent memory. Looking back now, it's impossible not to feel the weight of that home, the walls that heard everything but told nothing. The Haro family lived in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, yet within its boundaries unfolded an extraordinary tragedy, one that would later expose not only the fragility of a single family, but also the blindness of a community that mistook silence for safety. From the moment Emmanuel entered the world, there was already a shadow hanging over his home. The birth of a child should mark the beginning of protection and tenderness, yet within the Haro household, that light was fragile from the start. The atmosphere inside that small Cabazon home carried a tension that no one could quite name, and perhaps that was the most dangerous part of all. Nothing seemed overtly wrong, just uneasy, as though the walls themselves had learned to hold their breath. Emmanuel's early months were marked by unpredictability. Some days seemed calm, others filled with sharp exchanges behind closed doors. What outsiders perceived as the exhaustion of new parents was, in truth, the quiet erosion of stability. Jake's temper would flare suddenly, then vanish just as quickly, leaving behind a residue of unease. Rebecca, often caught between appeasement and fear of confrontation, withdrew into silence. To neighbors, they appeared ordinary enough as two navigating the chaos of raising a newborn. But those who lived nearby recalled hearing noises that unsettled them. Raised voices. Sudden thuds. Then nothing. Always nothing. When I first reviewed the investigation summaries, one phrase stood out: prolonged harm. It was written in the careful, sterile tone of official language, but behind those two words was a lifetime compressed into weeks. Emmanuel had been born into a cycle of volatility that began long before he took his first breath. His father carried a criminal history of cruelty toward another child, an act so serious it should have permanently prevented him from caring for any infant again. And yet, somehow, that warning never traveled far enough. The system that should have protected Emmanuel didn't intervene, not before his birth, not after, not ever. Each record, each report, reveals a moment when someone could have acted. There had been documented incidents, probation reviews, and even therapy recommendations that went unenforced. Each failure stacked upon the next until tragedy became inevitable. When I think about this, I can't help but wonder what would have changed if even one person had paused to question why a man with such a history was once again living with an infant. Neighbors later told investigators they had heard crying that seemed different, sharper, more distressed than what they expected from a baby that age. But as the days passed, they convinced themselves they were imagining it. In small communities, privacy often outweighs suspicion. People see, but they do not intervene. They hear, but they rationalize. It's easier that way to tell yourself it's just a bad night, just a rough week, just parenting. It's easier than facing the possibility that a child might be in danger. Inside the Haro home, small details began to accumulate, signs that, in retrospect, painted a heartbreaking picture. Medical appointments were missed. Visitors were no longer welcomed inside. Rebecca began appearing alone more often, carrying Emmanuel close but avoiding questions. Jake, meanwhile, seemed agitated whenever attention turned toward the baby. Even his attempts at affection appeared rehearsed, as though he was imitating what he believed a father should look like rather than what one should feel. The investigative documents, in terms that sound almost abstract, but to read between the lines is to see the pattern, moments of anger, silence afterward, explanations that never quite aligned. Emmanuel's condition, fragile and delicate, reflected not a single catastrophic event, but the slow accumulation of harm. This was not chaos erupting suddenly, it was erosion, the kind that wears through everything given enough time and neglect. When officials finally reviewed the full timeline, they noted that the warnings had existed in multiple places: case files, hospital notes, even informal remarks between agencies. Yet none of them connected. The system operated in fragments, and those fragments were not enough to save a child who needed unity, not bureaucracy. In reflecting on Emmanuel's life, it becomes impossible not to think of how many others like him exist, hidden behind doors that look just like everyone else's. His story forces me to confront a simple but painful truth: danger often looks ordinary until it's too late. The Haro home wasn't a scene of visible chaos. It was a space where unease became routine, where every opportunity for intervention slipped away, because no one wanted to believe what their instincts whispered. Emmanuel's short life should not be remembered only for how it ended, but for what it revealed. His existence, though brief, exposes the fragile intersection between family, community, and system, a triangle that collapses the moment one side fails. He lived in a world that had every chance to protect him and didn't. And now, his absence stands as a silent indictment of every overlooked report, every unanswered cry, and every moment of hesitation disguised as respect for privacy. In the end, the tragedy of Emmanuel Haro is not simply what was done to him, it is what wasn't done for him. The final days of Emmanuel's life fall somewhere between the 5th and 14th of August 2025, a window of time that investigators later defined with precision but could never fill with comfort. That period, just 9 days long, would hold the most excruciating silence of all. For everyone else, it was an ordinary week in Cabazon. For Emmanuel, it was the slow closing of every chance he ever had. By then, the house had grown quiet in the worst possible way. The arguments once shook the walls gave way to long stretches of stillness. When a home that was once loud becomes silent, it is rarely peace that follows its aftermath. The investigation would later determine that Emmanuel's injuries were consistent with what they termed aggravated assault, a phrase that fails to capture the depth of what that means for a child who could not even form words yet. It was during those last hours that the distance between cause and consequence collapsed entirely. His final hours were the darkest, most painful, and terrifying of all. That simple sentence, but its simplicity made it unbearable. Every time I read that line, I imagined the weight of those words inside that dimly lit house. Emmanuel was alone. There was no one to reach for him, no one to stop what was happening. His final cry, if there was one, was muffled by walls that had heard too much already. No neighbor reported hearing anything unusual that night. No passerby saw lights flicker. No sound escaped into the street. What remained afterward was an emptiness that no one could later explain. Investigators pieced together a timeline from the fragments that were left: text messages, inconsistent stories, and small details that only make sense when you know how it ends. They determined that whatever happened took place during a short window in early August, days before Rebecca's 911 call about a supposed kidnapping. That single act, the phone call that turned grief into deception, was not an act of panic. It was a decision. It marked the point where tragedy transformed into fabrication. Inside that home, the physical traces told a story that words could not. Certain items were cleaned too thoroughly, others left untouched. The baby's crib, once a symbol of protection, became the center of a crime scene. And yet, even as investigators catalog every inch of the room, the most haunting detail was what wasn't there: Emmanuel himself. His absence was a wound that no evidence list could heal. When I try to imagine those hours, I picture Rebecca sitting on the floor, her voice trembling, unsure whether to call for help or to stay silent. I imagine Jake pacing, convincing himself that control was still within reach. Their choices in that moment would define not only their futures but also the memory of a child who could no longer speak for himself. There are moments in every tragedy when someone could turn back. For Emmanuel, that moment never came. As daylight crept across the desert the next morning, the illusion began to take form. A story was built from panic and desperation, one that would travel across news outlets and ignite a nationwide search. But beneath the words missing child lay a truth that was already cold. The very people pleading for help knew exactly where to look. Forensic experts later concluded that Emmanuel's death occurred several days before Rebecca made that call. The signs were consistent, the evidence aligned, and the timeline left no space for doubt. The conclusion was grim but clear. Emmanuel had been gone long before anyone realized or pretended to realize that he was missing. Every time I revisit this case, I find myself lingering on the same thought. Somewhere in those final hours, the world failed to notice that a child's life was ending. The silence that filled that house wasn't natural, it was constructed, protected by fear and denial. And in that silence, Emmanuel's last moments disappeared without witness or rescue. When investigators presented their findings, they described what happened as a sequence of escalating harm that ended in irreversible consequence. To them, it was evidence. To me, it is a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always arrive with noise, it can unfold quietly, behind drawn curtains, in a house that looks like any other. Those hours between August 5th and 14th are not just a timestamp in a report. They are the measure of how long a community remained unaware that one of its smallest members was dying within reach. No siren blared, no neighbor knocked, no system intervened. Only afterward did the sound come, the echo of voices asking how it could have happened. Emmanuel's last hours cannot be rewritten. But they can be remembered for what they reveal, that silence is not innocence, and that the cost of ignoring small signs can be a life too brief to even say its own name. The cruelty of parents. In every homicide investigation, there is a moment when silence turns into confession. For the case of baby Emmanuel, that moment came inside a small, windowless interview room where detectives staged what they call a Perkins operation, a psychological maneuver designed to make suspects talk when they think no one is listening. It was there that Jake spoke. The words were quiet, almost casual, yet they shattered what remained of the illusion. He said he had taken Emmanuel's life and discarded him, like trash. For a moment, investigators thought they finally had their answer. But almost as soon as the words were documented, Jake retracted them. He claimed exhaustion, confusion, manipulation. The truth, once again, slipped through uncertainty. The sequence of events that followed was both methodical and desperate. Investigators launched new searches across Moreno Valley and nearby disposal sites, retracing every possible route between Cabazon and the 60 freeway. They believed Jake's account might hold fragments of truth, even if his full confession didn't. His statement about a dumpster was chillingly specific, and yet when they scoured those areas, they found nothing, no remains, no trace of a body, not even a piece of fabric linked to Emmanuel. Each location turned up empty, as if the desert itself had swallowed him whole.
Question I asked to authorities when we first got our opportunity, what information led them there? Take a listen.
We have a pretty strong indication of where the remains of...
One official said during the press conference. That sentence became the center of speculation. The sheriff's department refused to elaborate, citing some level of cooperation from Jake. To the public, it sounded like hope. To investigators, it was an admission wrapped in ambiguity. They knew Jake was capable of deceit, but they also knew he had information only the killer could possess. The challenge was separating his manipulations from the truth buried beneath them. When I read the detailed notes from that Perkins recording, what struck me wasn't just what Jake said, it was how he said it. His tone lacked panic, remorse, or even surprise. He described the act as if narrating a task, a sequence of steps completed under pressure. The words carried no grief, only fatigue. That emotional vacancy haunted the detectives who listened. They played the tape over and over, searching for a flicker of humanity, but found none. Rebecca's role remained a quieter mystery. Footage later obtained from surveillance cameras in a nearby industrial area showed a woman Resender near a dumpster on the morning after Emmanuel's estimated death. The timestamp placed her there when she claimed to be home. The footage was grainy, indistinct, but prosecutors saw enough to argue complicity. They believed she knew what Jake had done, or at the very least, what he was about to do. Her silence afterward became its own kind of evidence. The search for Emmanuel's remains soon evolved into a logistical nightmare. The area was vast, the terrain hostile, and time was against them. Cadaver dogs were deployed across miles of open ground, along service roads, and near landfill sites. The dogs alerted several times, but each alert led to the same crushing conclusion: false positives, decomposing animals, or ordinary waste. Every new excavation carried the same emotional weight as a burial, yet yielded only disappointment. Detectives described the process as chasing a shadow that kept moving just beyond reach. Behind the scenes, prosecutors debated whether a case could succeed without a body. The answer was yes, but only if the story could be proven through behavior, motive, and the digital trail left behind. Jake's own words, though recanted, were powerful enough to shape that story. The Perkins transcript gave jurors something to imagine, a picture of what likely happened when the cameras were off and the lights went out. I often find myself returning to that detail, the idea of disposal, of something as precious as a child reduced to refuse. It is not only the cruelty of the act that unsettles me but the symbolism of it. It speaks to a complete detachment from humanity, a collapse so deep that even guilt seems absent. To discard a child is to erase evidence of existence itself, to deny the world the chance to mourn properly. That's what makes Emmanuel's case so haunting. It leaves behind no grave, no closure, only questions. Investigators continue to hold on to faint hope that one day the desert might give back what it has taken. They still search quietly, methodically, calming news zones when tips emerge. Every officer who has worked the case admits that it lingers with them long after they leave the field. They remember the crib found empty, the scent dogs circling near dumpsters, the cold precision of the father's voice in that recording. The last line of one detective's report stays with me: the absence of a body does not mean the absence of a crime, it only means the desert has one more secret to keep. In the story of Emmanuel Haro, that secret remains buried somewhere between truth and denial, waiting for a day when silence finally breaks, and the smallest victim of all is found at last. Deception rarely begins with a lie. It begins with a story told convincingly enough to sound like truth. On August 14, 2025, Emmanuel Haro made that story public. She told authorities she had been attacked in the parking lot of a sporting goods store. According to her report, she was changing Emmanuel's diaper when a man approached, said a single word, "Allah," and struck her, leaving her unconscious. When she awoke, her baby was gone. The story was cinematic, horrifying, and precise enough to generate sympathy before anyone thought to question it. Within hours, the narrative had spread through local broadcasts. The young mother appeared shaken, pale, clutching a photograph of her missing son. Jake stood beside her, stoic but tearful. Together they embodied what every viewer wanted to believe: two broken parents united in grief. But deception has a fragile lifespan. The truth began to unravel almost immediately. Surveillance footage from the parking lot showed no sign of an attacker, no struggle, no car speeding away. Cameras positioned near the entrance captured Rebecca walking calmly toward her vehicle and driving off alone. There was no evidence of the man she described, no interruption in the footage, no missing seconds. The images were clear and continuous, leaving investigators with a single conclusion: the abduction never happened. That revelation marked the turning point. Detectives began cross-checking her timeline, comparing statements from store employees, and reviewing transactional data from nearby businesses. Each layer exposed another inconsistency. The time she claimed to have arrived didn't match store logs. Her phone, supposedly dropped during the attack, was still transmitting data with no interruption, no signs of panic. Every piece of evidence dismantled her story until nothing remained but performance. They told the world their baby had been kidnapped, a frantic 911 call, a desperate mother's voice, and a father standing by her side. The story was heartbreaking: a 7-week-old baby boy taken from a car in broad daylight. A community rushed to search. Prayers flooded social media and strangers lit candles for a child they had never met. But just days later, prosecutors revealed something far more disturbing. The so-called kidnapping was a lie. That was the sentence that echoed across every evening broadcast. And behind that headline was the most painful truth of all: the tears, the pleas, the trembling voices that captured public sympathy had all been rehearsed. When I watched those two short clips again, the first from the parking lot, the second from their press appearance, it felt like watching two parallel realities. In the footage from the lot, Rebecca moved with unsettling composure, adjusting her hair as she opened the car door. In the media footage days later, she trembled, her eyes red, her voice breaking as she begged for her baby's safe return. Between those two images lies the entire anatomy of deceit: stillness before the act, chaos after the lie. The couple's emotional performance fooled nearly everyone at first. Neighbors described feeling heartbroken, leaving candles at makeshift memorials and writing messages of prayer. Reporters noted how Jake would place a hand on Rebecca's shoulder each time she faltered, as though the two were drawing strength from one another. But the texts investigators later recovered painted a different picture entirely. They showed tension, resentment, and mutual blame. In one exchange, Jake accused Rebecca of ruining everything. In another, she pleaded for him to stick to the story. The phrase, "united front," appeared multiple times, a chilling reminder that even in private, their concern was not truth but consistency. The language of those messages was cold and strategic. They didn't read like the communications of grieving parents, they read like collaborators maintaining a cover. Every word was calibrated to align their narratives, to ensure that if one faltered, the other could recover the lie. What had begun as desperation evolved into calculation. When detectives confronted them with the surveillance footage, the shift was immediate. Rebecca's tears dried. Jake's composure hardened. Their earlier performances gave way to silence. Investigators later said that was the moment they knew the grief had never been real. It was a script, and they had finally reached the part where the actors ran out of lines. The two clips remain haunting in their simplicity. In one, Rebecca walks freely through a parking lot, unaware that every step will later expose her. In the other, she clings to her partner before cameras, weaving a tragedy that never happened. The juxtaposition between those images tells the story better than any confession could. What makes this deception so chilling isn't just the lie itself, but the precision with which it was built. Every gesture, every tear, every carefully chosen word served a purpose to redirect suspicion, to manufacture empathy, to delay the truth. The Haros didn't simply lie, they engineered a narrative designed to hold public attention while concealing the unthinkable. Looking back, the illusion was always fragile. Real grief doesn't need choreography. Real panic doesn't fit perfectly into a camera frame. And when the facade finally cracked, what remained was not the tragedy of an abduction, but the far darker tragedy of manipulation, a story of two parents who weaponized sorrow to hide what they had done, until the evidence refused to stay silent any longer. When the arrests finally came, they arrived not with sirens, but with exhaustion. By mid-October 2025, the public's faith in the Haro family's story had already collapsed. The cameras that once framed them as grieving parents now documented their fall from pretense to prosecution. On October 16, 2025, Jake stood before the court and entered a guilty plea. He did not contest the evidence, did not argue the inconsistencies, and did not offer comfort to those who had searched for his son. His statement was brief, devoid of the emotion that once carried his fabricated appeals for help. What struck everyone present was what he refused to say. Even as he admitted to the act that ended Emmanuel's life, he would not reveal where the child's body was. That silence became its own form of cruelty. Investigators pressed for detail how, when, where, but Jake held to his refusal. He seemed to understand that control was his last possession. The absence of the body had already complicated the case, and by keeping that secret, he ensured he remained necessary, the single person who could close the circle. Detectives described the moment as calculated restraint rather than remorse. One of them later summarized it in a line that has stayed with me. He chose silence because it made him the final witness to his own crime. Rebecca's behavior followed a different trajectory. While Jake folded under the weight of evidence, she maintained her not guilty plea. From the first appearance onward, her demeanor hardened. The tears that once flowed so freely during media interviews vanished. When questioned by prosecutors, she avoided detail, repeating phrases prepared by counsel short, measured, rehearsed. She declined every offer for an extended interview. Each time investigators asked for cooperation, she invoked her right to remain silent. Whether this silence was fear, guilt, or loyalty remains a matter of speculation, but it was silence all the same. The two short pieces of footage released after their arrests captured that contrast vividly. In the first, Kare's in a holding area, hands clasped, answering questions with curt nods. There is no trace of grief, only a kind of weary defiance. In the second, filmed days later during Rebecca's brief court exit, she moves quickly through a crowd of reporters, eyes fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the questions hurled at her. The difference between those images and their earlier performances was jarring. The people who once begged for mercy from strangers now offered none in return. Both defendants were formally charged not only with homicide, but also with filing false reports and deliberately misleading investigators. Those additional charges reflected the deliberate structure of their deception, the staged kidnapping call, the fabricated injuries, the public pleas. To the prosecution, these were not impulsive lies born of panic, they were elements of a plan designed to misdirect everyone involved, from neighbors to law enforcement. The filing of false reports became the thread connecting every act that followed Emmanuel's death. After the arraignment, the case shifted from discovery to endurance. Prosecutors assembled timelines built on digital data and witness statements. They cross-referenced phone logs, text messages, and GPS trails that contradicted the story told on August 14. Every contradiction strengthened their case, but the missing body remained a void no amount of data could fill. That void became the defense's only refuge. Without physical evidence of the child's remains, Rebecca's attorneys argued that the prosecution relied too heavily on inference. They painted her as a manipulated partner, a woman trapped by fear, not complicit by design. But outside the courtroom, public sentiment had already rendered its verdict. The footage of Jake's search escort along the 60 freeway, the confessions whispered and withdrawn, and Rebecca's detached demeanor, all merged into a single narrative of guilt. Each development reinforced the sense that Emmanuel's story was no longer about a missing child, but about a system struggling to reconcile justice with absence. When I think about those post-arrest weeks, what lingers most is the emptiness of their responses. Jake's admission without revelation and Rebecca's denial without emotion formed two halves of the same void. One refused to speak the truth, the other refused to acknowledge it. Together, they turned the search for Emmanuel into a labyrinth of partial truths and legal restraint. As of late October 2025, Emmanuel's remains have still not been found. The prosecution continues to treat the case as active, pursuing leads quietly, hoping one of the defendants will trade knowledge for leniency. Until then, their silence stands as both shield and confession. In the end, the court will decide what measure of truth can exist without a body. But for those who searched the desert, who lit candles and whispered prayers, justice will never feel whole until the smallest victim of all is finally brought home. Compassion and empathy from the community. The first memorial appeared quietly, almost shyly, just a handful of candles and a few wilted flowers placed along the walkway leading to the Haro home. By the next morning, the small display had transformed into something larger. A sea of soft toys, folded notes, and framed photographs surrounded the front gate. Someone had written, "For the little angel," on a sheet of cardboard, the ink running from melted wax. In the stillness of the desert morning, the house that had once concealed so much darkness became the center of public grief. People arrived in silence, standing side by side, strangers knighted by disbelief. It was as if the community needed to reclaim that space to replace deceit with mourning. The gesture spread quickly. By the afternoon, the memorial had grown into a mosaic of compassion. A small white cross leaned against the fence, surrounded by flowers, stuffed animals, and messages written in uneven handwriting. "Sleep peacefully, baby boy. You were loved, even if they couldn't show it." Someone tied a ribbon to the mailbox, and soon there were dozens fluttering in the wind, white for innocence, blue for hope. The candles burned long into the night, their flames reflecting in the windows of the house where Emmanuel's laughter should have been. The following week, on August 27, 2025, the town gathered for a vigil. I remember the way the sky looked that evening, a fading orange sinking behind the mountains, the air heavy with the kind of quiet that only comes when words fail. People came carrying flowers, holding each other's hands. Whispering prayers, they approached the makeshift altar. A small sign read, "Justice for Emmanuel Haro." The phrase became more than a slogan. It was a collective promise whispered into the night, a plea that his story would not fade like so many others. Two short video clips from that night remain etched in my mind. The first showed the crowd standing in complete stillness, candlelight flickering across faces streaked with tears. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The silence was not empty, it was reverent, a language shared without sound. The second captured a local pastor's voice trembling as he prayed. The words carried by wind across the crowd. He did not know fear, only love. May this community carry that love forward in his name. The people responded not with applause, but with soft murmurs of men, the kind that comes from hearts broken and humbled. It was in those moments that Cabazon felt different. The same neighbors who once passed by the Haro home without a thought now lingered at its fence, staring at the tributes left behind. They were reckoning not just with loss but with guilt. Many spoke openly about the unease they had once ignored. I saw them laughing. One woman told reporters, her voice breaking. "I told myself they were just tired parents. How could I stay?" Affection echoed what so many others felt, that silence, even when well-intentioned, can become complicity. In every tragedy, there comes a point where grief transforms into accountability. The vigil marked that shift. The people of Cabazon no longer gathered to mourn Emmanuel, they gathered to confront the silence that had allowed his story to unfold unnoticed. Parents brought their children, clutching them tightly. Teachers from the nearby elementary school spoke about vigilance and empathy. Volunteers organized a rotating watch to ensure the memorial would stay undisturbed, as if protecting it could somehow make up for the protection Emmanuel never received. By midnight, the street in front of the Haro house glowed with hundreds of candles. From a distance, it looked almost celestial, as though the stars headed to keep him company. I stood there watching, listening to the soft crackle of wax, the whispered prayers carried into the warm desert air. For once, the house didn't look menacing. It looked like a silent confession, surrounded by light. The memorial remained for weeks, a living testament to the town's remorse. Flowers were replaced daily, toys carefully rearranged to keep them from fading in the sun. Each visitor left something different, a note, a candle, a single white stone. The acts were small, but they built something powerful, a shared acknowledgement that indifference had consequences, that community only matters when it chooses to see. The vigil ended as it began, in silence. No speeches, no music, just a crowd holding candles, eyes lifted to the night. For Emmanuel, there were no last words, no farewell spoken from family. But on that evening, the town spoke for him in the only way it could, through presence, through apology, through the fragile light of 1,000 flames refusing to go out. In the weeks following the vigil, grief turned to anger. The same people who once stood in candlelight now spoke with a new kind of resolve. One that came from realizing Emmanuel's death wasn't only the result of two parents' actions, but of a system that had seen the warning signs years earlier and still looked away. What haunted everyone most wasn't simply what Jake had done, it was that he had already done it before. Back in 2018, a judge had given Jake probation after he permanently injured another infant from a previous relationship. It should have been the moment the system intervened decisively. Instead, it became the opening chapter of a tragedy that would repeat itself 7 years later. A district attorney speaking at a recent press conference didn't soften his words.
It was an outrageous error in judgment by this judge. And I don't have any problem saying that. I'm not attacking the judge personally. That decision was absolutely outrageous. Mr. Haro should have been in prison at the time that this crime happened.
His voice trembled, not from emotion, but from disbelief such leniency had ever been considered justice. I still remember watching that short clip, his statement framed by flashing cameras, the crowd behind him silent except for the occasional click of a shutter. There was something different about his tone. It wasn't the polished rhetoric of an official protecting procedure, it was raw frustration, the kind that comes from knowing that bureaucracy had allowed a second child to die. That one moment captured what the community had been trying to say for weeks. The system had failed Emmanuel before he was even born. Another broadcast segment followed soon after, the second piece of footage that defined the public's outrage. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse as citizens chanted for reform. One poster caught the camera's focus on a handwritten message quoting a viral statement that had spread across the country. The system failed Emmanuel. It was signed only with the handle AIM Legacy 23, but the phrase became the rallying cry for everyone who felt complicit through silence. Each time those words appeared on banners, news tickers, or hand-painted boards, they echoed the same indictment. If Jake had been properly sentenced in 2018, Emmanuel would still be alive. What began as isolated anger soon became a collective movement. Parents, teachers, and social workers gathered in town meetings, sharing their disbelief that someone with a violent record had been allowed unsupervised access to a newborn. The more they learned, the more incredulous they became. Court documents revealed that Jake had violated probation terms multiple times, yet his supervision had been minimal. There were no mandated counseling sessions, no child welfare alerts when Emmanuel was born, no cross-checking between agencies. Each misstep became a link in the chain that led to tragedy. When I spoke to residents who had followed the case closely, their outrage was mixed with exhaustion. One woman told me, "We can't keep lighting candles for children who never had a chance. Something has to break before we do." Her words felt like the summary of the entire investigation, compassion turning into demand. People no longer wanted vigils, they wanted accountability. Calls for reform quickly spread beyond Cabazon. Advocacy groups began petitioning for stricter oversight of probation cases involving harm toward minors. Others demanded a federal review of Child Protective Services procedures in California, pointing out that their monitoring system had failed not once, but twice, with the same individual. Lawmakers promised hearings, though the community's faith in promises had worn thin. For them, justice wasn't measured by courtroom sentences anymore. It was measured by whether future children would be safer than Emmanuel had been. The outrage also reached those within the system itself. Some officers admitted privately that they felt trapped by policy. One detective confided, "You see the patterns, you know what's coming, but the paperwork doesn't let you act until it's too late." That confession struck me as the most honest moment of all. It wasn't malice that failed Emmanuel, it was inertia. The slow grind of a system too cautious to prevent what it later punishes. As weeks passed, the ribbons tied to the Haro fence faded in the sun, but the anger did not. People no longer whispered about what happened inside that house. They spoke instead about what happened inside the courthouse years before. It was there, they said, that Emmanuel's fate was sealed not by his parents' cruelty, but by the leniency that freed a man proven dangerous. Now, each time I pass the memorial, I think of those two images. The prosecutor's voice cracking as he condemned the 2018 sentence, and the banner held high under desert light reading, "The system failed Emmanuel." Together, they formed the coda to a tragedy that should have ended long ago, a reminder that justice delayed is not only justice denied, but sometimes justice buried. Even amid outrage, a quieter current began to rise, an undercurrent of tenderness that cut through the anger like light through fog. People who had never met Emmanuel spoke of him as though they had. They used words like innocent, pure, and gentle. In every photograph released, his eyes seemed impossibly bright, touched by the world that would later betray him. Those images became a mirror reflecting what was lost, not just a child, but the hope that innocence could still be protected. 2 short clips circulated during those weeks that captured this shift in tone. In the first, a woman kneels before the memorial, her hands trembling as she places a tiny blue blanket on the ground. Her voice is barely audible, but the words carry, "Rest easy now, little one." The camera lingers on her face just long enough to show a tear tracing down her cheek before fading into the candlelight. In the second, taken at dusk outside the courthouse, a man holds a handwritten sign that reads, "Rest in peace where your fake parents won't touch you." The signature underneath, "Nerdy Addict," would come to represent what so many were feeling. Not just grief, but fierce protection. In that raw phrase was the collective cry of a public that had run out of gentler words. The phrase spread because it articulated what others could not: the need to reclaim Emmanuel from those who had harmed him. To name his parents as imposters wasn't cruelty, it was reclamation. The community had decided that the true guardians of this child's memory would be strangers bound by empathy, not blood. They lit candles not out of ceremony, but out of a personal sense of duty. In a town where everyone had once looked away, mourning became a form of atonement. By early September, that grief had crystallized into something else. Residents began pressing local authorities to renew the search for Emmanuel's remains. For them, closure wasn't symbolic, it was essential. Without a burial, there could be no peace. The sheriff's office released a brief statement acknowledging their efforts. "We have a pretty strong indication of where the remains of baby Emmanuel are." It was a cautious promise, but it was enough to reignite hope. Yet as days passed without discovery, that hope grew restless. Each sunrise felt like a delay too long, each sunset another reminder that the smallest among them was still missing. The town's unity deepened around that void. Parents carried their own children to vigils, whispering prayers that Emmanuel might finally be brought home. Church bells rang each Sunday at noon in his honor, their echoes rolling across Cabazon like soft thunder. Even children too young to understand asked questions. "Where is he now?" To which adults could only answer, "Somewhere safe." That phrase, repeated again and again, became a collective wish disguised as truth. What struck me most was how the town's affection turned into an act of preservation. People stopped using past tense when they spoke of him. "He is loved," they said, not "was." The shift mattered. It was as though by speaking of him in the present, they could keep him here, suspended somewhere between tragedy and remembrance. At one vigil, a woman, who had never met the Haro family, whispered to me, "He belongs to all of us now." Her tone was neither possessive nor defiant. It was protective, the way one might speak of a lost child found again, if only in memory. The demand for justice and the longing for closure merged into one plea: find him. Not for evidence, not for trial, but for dignity. To the community, recovery meant restoration, proof that even in the aftermath of deceit, truth could still prevail. Volunteers gathered on weekends, scanning desert terrain with quiet persistence. Some carried photos of Emmanuel clipped to their jackets, so that if they found anything, he would be the one watching over the discovery. As the search stretched on, the memorial outside the Haro house began to change. The flowers wilted faster in the summer heat, but each time they did, someone replaced them. New toys appeared: a rubber duck, a rattle, a small truck with its wheels buried in dust. The offerings grew not out of ceremony, but from love unspent, redirected toward a child who had never known it long enough. Even now, when I think of Emmanuel, I think of that sign from the courthouse, the one that said, "Rest in peace where your fake parents won't touch you." Harsh as it was, it carried truth. It wasn't anger alone, it was guardianship reborn. Through collective affection, the town reclaimed what the system and his parents had denied him: safety, belonging, and the final tenderness of being remembered. Why parents aren't honest about the corpse. What defined Jake and Rebecca after the tragedy was not grief, it was indifference. Every action they took following Emmanuel's death seemed driven by calculation rather than conscience. From the beginning, their responses followed a pattern: conceal, distort, survive. It was never about their child, it was about self-preservation. The evidence revealed a chilling absence of empathy, the kind that transforms a tragedy into a demonstration of moral emptiness. The footage released weeks later captured this contrast vividly. In the first clip, Jake appears in his prison jumpsuit, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. When reporters shout questions, "Where is Emmanuel?" he looks away unmoved. That brief silence speaks louder than words. The second clip, recorded during his transfer between facilities, shows him laughing quietly with an officer, as though the world had already forgotten the reason for his confinement. Those moments broke through illusion of remorse. he had tried to perform in the past. What remained was a man stripped of facade, revealing not guilt but a cold awareness of control. His refusal to reveal the location of Emmanuel's body amplified that perception. Investigators believe Jake's silence wasn't driven by sentiment or fear, it was strategy. By withholding the truth, he retained leverage. The absence of a body meant uncertainty, and uncertainty could blur the line between manslaughter and first-degree murder. In that ambiguity, he found protection. The cruelty of this decision lies not just in the withholding itself, but in the deliberate prolonging of a child's erasure. To hide Emmanuel even in death was to claim power one final time over a life already taken. Rebecca's silence only deepened the sense of callousness. Her refusal to cooperate, her carefully measured answers, and her unbroken composure during hearings painted the portrait of someone who had learned to mirror detachment. Where Jake's cruelty was overt, hers was quite a form of indifference masquerading as obedience. Whether her silence came from fear or complicity, the outcome was the same: no remorse, no reckoning, only distance. What investigators uncovered later made that indifference even harder to comprehend. The disposal of the body, if Jake's jailhouse confession is true, was not an act of panic but of deliberation. If Emmanuel had indeed been discarded as waste, it was not just the concealment of a crime, it was the final desecration of a child who deserved dignity, even in death. The act stripped him of humanity twice, first in life, and again in burial. When I review the transcripts and the footage, one detail lingers above all: the absence of apology. Not once did Jake or Rebecca express regret, not to investigators, not to the public, not to Emmanuel. Their focus was narrow, self-centered, transactional. Every plea, every legal motion, every withheld detail revolved around the same axis that they stood to lose. The gulf between their suffering and the suffering they caused was immeasurable. In the courtroom, their lawyers spoke in tones of restraint and reason, but even that language could not disguise what had been lost. When the prosecution reminded the jury that the child's remains had never been recovered, a silence fell over the room. For a moment, all that existed was the emptiness where Emmanuel should have been. That silence, cold, heavy, unrelieved, became the measure of their remorse. I remember watching one officer leave the stand after testifying. His voice had trembled slightly when he spoke about the search that led nowhere. Outside, he told reporters, "You can't understand the kind of person who could do this, and then sleep." His words carried the disbelief of a man who had seen too much and still could not accept what he'd witnessed. The story of Jake and Rebecca is not only about cruelty, it is about absence, the absence of conscience, of humanity, of the most basic reverence for life. Their actions after the crime revealed more than any confession could. Jake's laughter in the footage, Rebecca's silence in court, the continued concealment of their son's body, all of it forms a portrait of people who valued control more than truth. In the end, their punishment may satisfy the law, but it will never undo the absence they created. Emmanuel's memory remains trapped in uncertainty, waiting to be found, while those responsible remain defined not by their crimes alone, but by what they chose not to feel. Their callousness was not merely the absence of remorse, it was the deliberate decision to live without it. The longer the body remained missing, the clearer it became that what Jake and Rebecca were hiding went beyond neglect or recklessness. Investigators began to suspect that the reason Emmanuel had not been found was because finding him would expose something far more terrible. In the early press briefings, the tone of officials was measured, careful not to speculate, but every phrase hinted at the same unspoken truth. The concealment itself was a message. The first piece of footage that suggested this change in tone came from the press conference where a lead investigator stated. His expression tightened as he spoke, as if the words themselves carried more than he was willing to say. Behind him, the sheriff nodded but offered no elaboration. When pressed by reporters about what led them to that area,
"I'm not going to go into grave detail about that, but there is some level of cooperation with the suspects involved in this, and we're trying,"
he replied. Those two sentences are guarded, deliberate, spoken volumes. Cooperation without clarity meant misdirection. It meant the truth was being managed, not shared. A second video, recorded just hours later, showed investigators leaving the search site along the 60 freeway. The sun was setting, the brush casting long shadows over the roadside. Cadaver dogs circled a cordoned area while officers carried equipment back to their vehicles. The camera panned briefly toward Jake, in his prison jumpsuit, standing beside a detective. His head tilted down, hands cuffed, expression not readable. He said nothing, but the stillness of that moment carried its own weight. If he knew where Emmanuel was, his silence wasn't grief, it was strategy. Authorities began exploring the theory that the body had not been simply discarded but hidden deliberately, perhaps to obscure evidence of prolonged harm. Forensic experts quietly acknowledged that certain injuries, if discovered, could transform the entire legal framework of the case. The difference between manslaughter and a capital offense often depends not only on intent but on evidence of cruelty. If Emmanuel's body showed unmistakable signs of suffering, it would no longer be a story of panic, it would be premeditation. And that was the line Jake and Rebecca could not afford to cross. Rebecca's behavior only reinforced these suspicions. She refused all cooperation, clinging rigidly to the kidnapping narrative long after it had collapsed under scrutiny. Her refusal to admit otherwise seemed less like denial and more like self-protection. Each time investigators questioned her, she repeated the same rehearsed fragments: a stranger, a parking lot, a word whispered before the world went black. What she didn't say spoke louder than what she did. By holding on to a story already disproven by surveillance footage, she was not defending the truth, she was defending herself from implication in whatever else had happened. Rumors about the body being discarded in a trash site spread quickly, but law enforcement was careful to temper those claims. The sheriff dismissed that version of events directly, calling it speculative and inconsistent with the evidence. The denial itself, though, revealed another possibility: that the concealment was more deliberate, more elaborate than anyone had imagined. A dump would have been careless, desperate. What investigators were confronting appeared meticulous. Someone had taken time, effort, and knowledge of terrain to ensure the child would not be found. This possibility reshaped the investigation. Search teams began focusing on specific geographic patterns: remote desert areas, abandoned properties, irrigation sites anywhere accessible yet isolated. Drones scanned for ground disturbances, digital forensics traced vehicle routes. But even with these efforts, no discovery came. Every failed search only deepened the conviction that the body had been placed somewhere chosen with intent, perhaps even prepared in advance. I found myself replaying that footage again and again, trying to read the space between words. When the official said,
that is aware of evidentiary things that we are certainly concerned with. So we're going to take every step to not only work with any suspect or witness involved in this, because at the end of the day, we have to bring a case to Mike and they have to charge it, and we have to make sure that every single thing, no matter what is told to us or what we discover in terms of evidence, is the right thing, and that we followed up extensively.
It struck me how much of the truth was being spoken in half sentences. The investigators weren't just searching, they were negotiating. And in that negotiation, Jake's silence became currency. The phrase, "some level of cooperation," lingered in every report, suggesting that partial truths were being traded for leniency. Perhaps he had revealed fragments of where Emmanuel might be, but not the full picture. Perhaps Rebecca had confirmed certain details, but withheld others that would expose her own role. The result was a carefully managed silence that kept the worst of the truth buried both literally and figuratively. In the end, what remains most haunting is the implication behind their secrecy. A body hidden deliberately does not speak of panic, it speaks of fear, not of justice, but of exposure. Whatever happened in those final hours, whatever the investigators believe lies beneath the desert soil, it was enough to drive two parents to rewrite reality itself. Emmanuel's disappearance was not an accident, not an impulse. It was a story rewritten to hide what no one wanted to see. By the time the case entered its second phase, the courtroom had shifted from a place of mourning to a battlefield of calculation. What had begun as an emotional narrative of loss evolved into a contest of precision: how much truth could be proven, and how much could remain hidden. Jake and Rebecca's survival no longer depended on morality but on tactics. Each word, each silence, each withheld detail became part of a larger legal game. The first courtroom footage from that period captured the moment Jake's new defense team entered the negotiation phase. He sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. When the judge asked whether he intended to cooperate with ongoing recovery efforts, his attorney intervened. "My client reserves his right to silence pending continued discussion regarding potential sentencing outcomes." The phrasing was deliberate, clinical, emotionless, but its meaning was unmistakable. Jake was withholding information as leverage. Behind closed doors, prosecutors were weighing a narrow exchange: partial cooperation in return for a reduced sentence, potentially in the range of 25 years to life instead of a full life term without parole. That moment marked the transformation of the case from tragedy to transaction. The same man who once begged the public to bring my baby home was now using the child's location as a bargaining chip. In that decision lay the final proof of his self-interest. For Jake, truth had become negotiable, a commodity traded for time. Prosecutors, aware of how vital physical evidence was to solidify their case, found themselves trapped between moral duty and legal pragmatism. Without a body, conviction would depend entirely on circumstantial proof: text messages, surveillance footage, digital records, and witness statements, all of which painted a damning but incomplete picture. The second courtroom recording showed Rebecca's defense team advancing a different strategy. They built their argument on the very absence that haunted the case. No body, no proof of death. The comparison to the notorious Florida trial years earlier was unavoidable. Like the defendant in that case, Rebecca's attorneys sought to exploit uncertainty, framing her as a confused, grieving mother rather than a conspirator. They emphasized that her cooperation had been limited not by guilt, but by trauma. The strategy was thin but effective without Emmanuel's remains. Every narrative had room to bend. I remember the prosecutor's response during one of those hearings. His tone was steady, restrained, but beneath it lay visible frustration. He addressed the court. The lack of physical recovery does not erase the totality of evidence. We have messages, we have contradictions, and we have video that undermines every claim the defendants have made. His words drew strength from conviction, yet even he knew that in the eyes of a jury, absence has power. A missing body could transform certainty into speculation. Privately, investigators admitted that the legal challenge felt like chasing a shadow. Digital forensics traced the Haro's movements with near-perfect precision cell tower pings, deleted texts, time-stamped surveillance, but what they lacked was the irrefutable proof that only a body could provide. Without it, every conclusion risked appearing as inference rather than fact. Defense attorneys understood this vulnerability well, repeating every turn, no remains, no certainty. The prosecutor's case rested heavily on context: Jake's criminal history, the staged kidnapping, the conflicting alibis. These elements built a narrative that made sense emotionally, but the law demands something colder, proof beyond reasonable doubt. And so, while the moral truth of the case felt clear, its legal truth remained suspended. The jury would not be asked whether they believed Jake and Rebecca were guilty, but whether they could be certain. Meanwhile, Jake's silence continued to serve him. Every day he refused to disclose the burial site. His value as a bargaining piece grew. Each week of non-cooperation made the state's desperation more visible. And though the prosecution refused to yield publicly, those close to the case admitted that the possibility of a plea bargain 25 years to life was increasingly being discussed behind closed doors. Rebecca's position remained more fragile but more ambiguous. Her attorneys leaned into the absence of direct evidence linking her to Emmanuel's death. They cast her as a woman under the control of a volatile partner, a mother manipulated into complicity she could not comprehend. It was the same story they had told since the beginning, refined now into legal precision. As hearings continued, the trial's atmosphere grew heavier, not from new revelations but from the quiet erosion of hope. The community outside the courthouse still prayed for discovery, but inside, it became clear that the truth had become a currency neither side could afford to spend. The prosecution had evidence but not finality. The defense had silence but not innocence. In the end, that was the paradox at the heart of the Haro case. Justice depended on what remained hidden. Jake's silence promised him time. Rebecca's denial promised her ambiguity. And for Emmanuel, the only one with nothing to hide, the law could offer only questions still waiting for a body to answer. In the end, we've tracked hundreds of child disappearance cases over the years, and stories like the Haro one hit hardest because they show exactly how far a fake kidnapping report can spiral. It starts with a 9/11 call, a tearful press conference, and a community rallying around what looks like pure tragedy. But in true crime, we know these setups can morph into something way darker: a cover for mistreatment, a delay tactic for investigators, and a way to buy time while evidence vanishes. The Haro case is the textbook worst case. What begins as an abduction ends up exposing family secrets, system failures, and parents who rather hide a body than face the truth. It's a brutal reminder that the monster isn't always a stranger in a van. Sometimes it's wearing the same smile you waved at yesterday. Now look at the open cases still hanging out there, and ask yourself if they're headed down the same ugly path. Take Lily and Jack Sullivan, 6 and 4 years old, when they vanished from their mom's place in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, on May 2, 2025. That frantic early morning 9/11 call kicked off searches, but RCMP never found solid signs of a strangers. Later, in October 2025, new witnesses talked about a vehicle circling the night before, yet police are skeptical. The kid's grandmother just spoke to CTV News Atlantic last week, clinging to hope while volunteer searches turn up nothing. We see the pattern: family statements, no eyewitnesses, slow agency response. If it mirrors Haro, the truth might be internal: a household accident spun into a disappearance, remains tucked away in nearby woods, waiting for someone to crack. Same vibe with Summer Wells, the 5-year-old who disappeared from her Tennessee home on June 15, 2021. Over 4 years gone, and TBI just dropped an age-progressed image in August 2025 showing her at maybe 9 with longer hair. Dad Don still insists on abduction, and they organized a fresh Beach Creek search in July. 0 results. No new DNA, no security cam hits, just old family tensions bubbling up. After this long, odds lean toward a covered-up incident, not a random grab panic after an accident, body hidden in familiar rural spots. The endgame could echo Haro, a late confession, concealment charges, but justice too delayed for real closure. These unresolved cases force us to stare at the dark side of missing kids alerts. They launch with hope and hashtags, but too often crash into family deception. What do you think? Are we missing red flags in Lily and Jack's story, or Summers? Will silence finally break like it did in Haro, or are we in for more years of manufactured hope? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe, and let's keep digging into these mysteries together.